sudden death cast an immediate hush over the garden, though it was the sort of hush that trembled with curiosity and unease rather than genuine mourning. Mrs. Bantry clutched her parasol as if it were a shield against the incomprehensible, while Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her lap. From this vantage point, she could see more than the bodies and the expressions. She could see the subtle shifts in behavior that often spoke louder than words. The villagers, unused to such calamities, began to murmur among themselves. Some whispered theories of fainting or sudden illness. Others speculated about old grudges and past arguments, though none spoke with certainty. Mr. Clement, the constable, had already begun ushering the more excitable guests toward the house, murmuring instructions in a low voice, yet even he looked momentarily unsteady. A few of the younger men hovered at the edges of the group, half wanting to help, half drawn by the morbid fascination of a corpse in their usually placid village. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the body itself. The man was middle-aged, well-dressed, but not overly so, an unremarkable figure, really, had it not been for the unnatural stillness with which he lay. There was something deliberate about the way one foot had scuffed the gravel, as though he had attempted a step before succumbing to whatever had struck him down. Even now, as onlookers whispered, she noted the slight creases in his forehead, the tension in his jaw, and the way his hands were positioned. Small, seemingly trivial details, yet details that spoke volumes to those who knew how to look. Nearby, a small knot of women clustered together, exchanging theories with the energy of seasoned commentators. Perhaps it was a heart attack, ventured Miss Ashcombe, a newcomer to the village, her voice carrying the tentative note of someone eager to belong. I heard he had complained of chest pains at the market last week. She glanced around, as if seeking confirmation or refutation. Or perhaps it was something more sinister, Mrs. Price interjected, her voice low but sharp. She adjusted her apron as if readying herself for action even in the midst of tragedy. I saw him speaking rather heatedly with Mr. Linton just yesterday. Could there have been a quarrel? Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The villagers were eager to supply motives before they even knew the facts, yet she could not dismiss their observations outright. Often, it was these very half-truths, the snippets of overheard conversations and the fleeting glances between neighbors, that illuminated the darker corners of human nature. A younger constable arrived, carrying a small notebook and pencil, looking every bit as uncertain as the villagers he was supposed to assist. He approached Mr. Clement, and the two whispered hurriedly, glancing toward the gathering crowd. Miss Marple noted the quick, almost furtive nod exchanged between them. A small movement, almost invisible, but revealing an acknowledgement that something about this death did not align with the usual accidents or sudden illnesses the village sometimes endured. The deceased was eventually covered with a plain white sheet, though Miss Marple noted that his shoes remained visible, the left slightly turned outward as though frozen mid-step. Around the edges of the sheet, the gravel had shifted slightly, as if someone had knelt or crouched beside him, perhaps to help, perhaps to examine. Each minute observation, while unnoticed by others, added to the quiet accumulation of facts in her mind. By mid-afternoon, the villagers had returned to the house for tea and a semblance of composure. Yet the atmosphere was heavy with speculation, the polite chatter punctuated by uneasy glances toward the hedge maze, where the body had been found. Miss Marple moved among them with quiet grace, offering a small word of comfort here, a nod of acknowledgement there, all the while listening and observing. She did not need to ask questions. They came freely, often revealing more than the speakers intended. The vicar, a gentle man whose calm demeanor had previously lent a sense of order to village events, now stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly to anyone who would listen. "It is most unusual, most unfortunate," he murmured, his eyes flicking toward the window that overlooked the garden. "St. Mary Mead has known its share of troubles, yes, but never has such a thing occurred in broad daylight, in the midst of our summer fete." Miss Marple listened with her characteristic patience. She had long known that beneath the serene surface of any small community, currents of resentment and secrets ran deep. Arguments over property boundaries, family rivalries, whispered scandals. These were the threads that, when tugged, could unravel into events as dramatic as the one now before her. Her gaze fell upon a young girl seated at the corner of the room, fiddling with a silver bracelet and avoiding eye contact with anyone. There was a subtle tension in the way she held herself, a nervous energy that suggested she had noticed more than she was letting on. Miss Marple made a mental note, as always, to observe without drawing attention. The tiniest details, the smallest gestures, often revealed the most. By the time the evening sun had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the garden and village streets, the first official reports were being whispered. Mr. Clement and his assistant were certain it was an accident, though the constable's uncertainty lingered in the corners of their statements. Miss Marple, for her part, had already begun to sketch in her mind the map of relationships, tensions, and behaviors that could explain the tragedy. She said nothing aloud. To do so now would be premature. In St. Mary Mead, life had always moved at a gentle pace, measured by the ticking of church clocks and the rhythm of market days. Yet on this day, the garden party would be remembered not for its roses or its tea, but for the shadow that had fallen unexpectedly across the sunlit paths. And while the villagers speculated and worried, Miss Marple's quiet mind began to assemble the first pieces of a puzzle whose full picture had yet to emerge. As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to hold its breath. Windows glimmered with lamplight, casting warm reflections on the cobblestones, yet within the households, uneasy murmurs replaced the usual evening calm. In the sitting room of Gable House, Miss Marple sat quietly near the fireplace, a knitting basket in her lap. She was surrounded by villagers eager to make sense of the day's shocking events, though none truly saw the subtle observation taking place behind her calm grey eyes. Mrs. Bantry, still trembling from the earlier excitement, had taken it upon herself to offer tea and biscuits to anyone who might be in need of comfort or distraction. She moved briskly between guests, her words a mixture of reassurances and tentative speculation. "I still cannot imagine how it happened," she said repeatedly, though her tone suggested more curiosity than sorrow. "One moment he was walking near the sundial, and the next, well, it is simply dreadful." Miss Marple's gaze drifted around the room, noting reactions rather than listening to the words themselves. Mr. Linton, a respected farmer with a strong jaw and calloused hands, was seated stiffly in an armchair, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His fingers drummed lightly against his knees, and his lips pressed into a thin line, as if rehearsing explanations he had not yet voiced. From this, Miss Marple inferred tension, perhaps unease, perhaps guilt, though in what measure she could not yet be certain. Across the room, Miss Ashcombe fidgeted nervously with the lace trim of her sleeve. Her earlier assertion about the deceased's health now seemed less confident. She glanced repeatedly toward the doorway, as if expecting someone else to arrive and shed light on the situation. Miss Marple noticed the subtle quickening of her pulse beneath the thin fabric of her wrist and tucked the detail into her mental ledger. People often revealed more through minor, involuntary gestures than through spoken words. The vicar moved quietly among the guests, murmuring soft reassurances, yet his brow was furrowed, betraying thoughts heavier than his words admitted. "We must remember," he said in a low voice to a small cluster of villagers, "that appearances are not always as they seem. We should not leap to conclusions." His remark, though measured, carried an undercurrent of caution that Miss Marple interpreted as a sign he had noticed something, though he was withholding it. Outside, the garden had become a scene of careful containment. Mr. Clement, accompanied by his younger assistant, had roped off the area around the sundial. Even in this, the constable's uncertainty showed. He barked gentle instructions, directing a couple of onlookers to remain behind the boundary, yet his eyes kept flicking toward the shadows beneath the oak tree, as if expecting the truth to step out from between them. Miss Marple's attention, however, was not on the barricades but on the subtler movements around her. She noted Mrs. Price's frequent glances toward the hedge maze and the way she pressed her hands together as though restraining herself. She observed young Timothy pacing restlessly near the fireplace, a hand running through his hair in nervous habit, while another villager, Mr. Higgins, a retired schoolmaster, seemed oddly distant, his mind elsewhere despite being physically present. It was in these quiet, overlooked moments that Miss Marple gathered her first insights. People, she had long understood, carried their own stories and secrets like invisible threads. A man might lie with his words, a woman conceal tension behind smiles, yet their behaviors, small and almost imperceptible, betrayed truth. In St. Mary Mead, a village where everyone knew everyone else's histories, these betrayals of manner were never lost on someone who knew how to observe. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the doctor, a tall man with a grave expression. He carried himself with the certainty of knowledge, yet even he seemed uneasy. "There is nothing to be done tonight," he said quietly. "I have examined the scene, and preliminary indications suggest the death was sudden, perhaps even violent, though I cannot yet determine the precise cause. Tomorrow, further examination will be necessary." His words, careful as they were, sent another ripple through the villagers, heightening both fear and speculation. A murmur rose among the guests. Some were quick to attribute the death to a heart attack. Others whispered of poisoning, and a few, eyes wide with the thrill of drama, hinted at foul play. Miss Marple allowed them to speak, making no comment, merely watching. The interplay of fear, curiosity, and pretense was a rich tapestry, one she could read with the patience of a lifetime spent among human nature. When the doctor departed, the villagers seemed smaller, their conversation quieter. They clustered into groups, each exchanging versions of events, each seeking reassurance in shared assumptions. Yet for all their chatter, none noticed the subtle inconsistencies, the faint trace of scuff on the gravel still visible beneath the sundial, the slight displacement of the garden's flowers, or the irregular angle of a fallen leaf that hinted at hurried movement. Miss Marple remained seated. Her knitting paused, her eyes alert. She did not speak, for she did not yet need to. Observation, she knew, was the first step toward truth. Words, when they arrived too soon, often muddled understanding. Careful attention, however, always revealed the hidden patterns. In the quiet glow of Gable House, surrounded by villagers eager to explain what they had seen, Miss Marple's mind was already untangling threads that would, in time, reveal a far more intricate story than anyone yet imagined. By the time night had fully fallen, the tea had been drained, the biscuits consumed, and the village had retreated to the comfort of lamps and hearths. Yet St. Mary Mead was not at peace. Somewhere within the gentle lanes and neatly kept gardens, the first whispers of a secret, long concealed, were beginning to stir, and Miss Marple, as always, would notice them first. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with an unassuming cheerfulness that belied the tension lingering from the previous day. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and walked the familiar lanes of the village, her mind quietly working over the events at Gable House. The villagers, however, were already stirring with fresh speculation, their conversations tinged with fear, curiosity, and the unmistakable thrill of an unsolved mystery. By mid-morning, Mr. Clement had formally requested that all who had been present at the garden party remain at home should he wish to question them further. Naturally, this directive was met with a mixture of compliance and whispered complaints. Mrs. Bantry bustled about her drawing-room, serving tea to a small circle of neighbors, all eager to compare notes on what they had seen and heard. Miss Marple, quietly observing the room, noted the slight ways in which people revealed their priorities. Some were more concerned with appearances, others with diverting suspicion, and a few, most interestingly, betrayed glimpses of genuine anxiety. Young Timothy, whose nervous energy had been so noticeable the previous afternoon, arrived with Miss Ashcombe. Their conversation, meant to distract themselves from worry, betrayed hints of private concerns. Timothy's hands trembled slightly as he poured tea, while Miss Ashcombe's eyes darted toward the window more than once, as if fearing someone outside might overhear. Miss Marple's gaze rested lightly upon them. The nervousness was genuine, yet not necessarily an indication of guilt. Often it was the innocent who betrayed themselves first when faced with sudden tragedy. Across the room, Mr. Linton stood near the fireplace, ostensibly observing the group, but in reality maintaining an almost imperceptible distance. His posture was rigid, the muscles of his jaw working almost unconsciously. Miss Marple made a mental note of his avoidance of eye contact and the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long on certain faces. The villagers often underestimated what a subtle glance could reveal, but Miss Marple had long understood that people's attention, especially when drawn unwillingly, left a trail. The vicar, too, had arrived to offer moral support, his gentle demeanor and soft voice attempting to calm the rising tide of unease. Yet even he seemed unsettled, and Miss Marple noticed the careful choice of words he used, as though he was managing not only his thoughts, but those of the villagers surrounding him. "It is most distressing," he said, "and yet we must be patient. Truth, like the tide, will come in its own time." His statement, intended to soothe, contained a subtle warning. Not all was as simple as it seemed, and the answers might be slower to reveal themselves than anyone hoped. Outside, the garden was quiet, though not entirely empty. The ropes around the sundial had been reinforced, and a small group of neighbors lingered, peering through the gaps with curiosity. Miss Marple had stepped into the garden briefly, noting that the gravel where the man had fallen remained undisturbed except for the faint scuff she had observed the day before. She knelt down, examining the subtle impressions, careful not to disturb them, and filed each observation into her memory. Every minor detail could, in time, become part of the larger pattern. By late morning, Mr. Clement began formal questioning, inviting villagers to recount the events leading up to the man's death. Most spoke in hesitant tones, their statements often contradicting one another in minor ways that were easily overlooked by the constable. Miss Marple, standing politely at the back of the small group, noted each inconsistency, each hesitation, and each overly confident assertion. People seldom lied in any thorough, sustained way. It was in the slip of the tongue, the inadvertent glance, or the nervous shift of a hand that truth quietly revealed itself. A subtle pattern began to emerge even before noon. Miss Marple observed that those closest to the sundial at the moment of the incident seemed unusually tense or distracted, while others who had been farther away appeared calm yet overly eager to provide explanations. Miss Marple filed these impressions, her mind quietly mapping connections between physical proximity, attention, and behavioral cues. She made no comment, for it was far too early to draw conclusions, but the threads were already weaving a network that she would follow carefully. Meanwhile, the doctor returned to perform a more thorough examination of the body. His approach was clinical, yet he too could not conceal a trace of puzzlement. "There is nothing obvious that indicates a natural cause," he remarked quietly to Mr. Clement. "No sign of struggle, no apparent heart condition severe enough to cause sudden death. I cannot rule out external intervention, though it would require careful investigation." The villagers listened, some whispering to each other, some clutching their cups a little too tightly. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression that followed each word. As the morning wore on, subtle interactions began to reveal more than any formal questioning could. Mrs. Price, who had been unusually silent, cast furtive glances toward the sundial when she thought no one was watching. A young boy, Timothy's cousin, clutched his mother's skirt with quiet tension, eyes following the movement of adults with careful attention. Miss Marple registered every reaction, no matter how small, for she knew that guilt, fear, or simple awareness of secrets often manifested in the tiniest, most easily overlooked gestures. By midday, it became clear that the village had settled into a tense rhythm of observation, speculation, and polite civility. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in the corner, had already begun forming the first tentative outlines of the puzzle before her. Each scuff in the gravel, each uneasy glance, and each whispered word contributed to a complex pattern of human behavior, one that promised to reveal truths that were far from the surface. And as the villagers sipped their tea and exchanged stories, unaware of how revealing their actions were, Miss Marple felt the familiar quiet thrill of anticipation. The answers, as always, would come, but only if she remained patient, observant, and above all, discreet. By the afternoon, St. Mary Mead had assumed the appearance of a village paused in suspense. Shops closed earlier than usual, shutters were drawn on some windows, and the streets, normally alive with the gentle hum of daily life, seemed hushed, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, having completed a slow walk through the empty lanes, returned to Gable House, where the gathering had resumed, though now the air was thick with speculation. The constable, Mr. Clement, had begun to concentrate his inquiries on those who had been nearest the sundial at the moment of the incident. Miss Marple observed this with interest. It was natural for the police to follow proximity, yet she knew human behavior often complicated matters. Some who were near might be entirely innocent, while those farther away sometimes held the most revealing secrets. Still, the police's focus would draw out reactions that could prove more telling than any direct question. It was Mr. Linton who first drew attention. The farmer had been unusually quiet that morning, and now his posture, once merely stiff, had begun to betray subtle tremors of unease. When questioned by Mr. Clement about his whereabouts during the garden party, Linton's gaze flickered momentarily toward the sundial before he forced himself to meet the constable's eyes. "I was near the rose trellis," he said, voice measured but slightly strained. "I saw nothing unusual. Truly, I hardly noticed the gentleman until he had already fallen." Miss Marple, knitting slowly at the corner of the room, noted every minute gesture, the tightening of his jaw, the small twitch in his left hand, the way his eyes darted briefly toward Timothy and Miss Ashcombe as if seeking reassurance or distraction. Most villagers would have dismissed these as nerves, yet to Miss Marple they were hints, delicate but meaningful. "I was near the fountain myself," Timothy interjected, nervously, eager to draw attention away from Linton. He pushed his cup of tea across the table, hands shaking slightly. "I didn't see anything until the cry. It all happened so quickly." His voice trailed off, the tension in his shoulders betraying more than the words. Miss Ashcombe, at his side, offered a small nod of agreement, though her eyes remained fixed on the door as if contemplating an exit. Mrs. Price, standing by the fireplace, cleared her throat sharply. "I think it would be foolish to dismiss the obvious," she said, her voice low but firm. "We all saw him speaking rather heatedly with Mr. Linton only yesterday. Surely, tempers do not vanish overnight." She glanced pointedly toward Linton, and for a moment the room held its collective breath. Even the vicar's expression tightened, a slight frown crossing his face as he absorbed her words. Miss Marple's attention, however, shifted subtly to the garden outside. Through the open window, she noticed a small, nearly imperceptible disturbance in the flower bed near the sundial. A petal had been crushed, leaving a tiny mark on the gravel that suggested someone had knelt or stepped there in a hurry. It was a detail that would escape all but the most attentive observer, yet it struck her immediately as significant. Meanwhile, Mr. Clement's questioning continued, drawing out further inconsistencies. Linton insisted he had not moved from the trellis, yet a neighbor recalled seeing him near the sundial briefly. Timothy's account placed him several yards away, yet he could not fully recall whether he had passed the hedge maze moments before the cry. Each discrepancy was small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of uncertainty that Miss Marple quietly catalogued. The villagers themselves added layers of confusion and insight. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager to mediate, tried to steer the discussion toward reconciliation and calm, yet her well-intentioned words only served to highlight tensions between those present. Miss Ashcombe, usually composed, fidgeted with a napkin, her pale fingers wringing the fabric as she attempted to maintain a poised exterior. Miss Marple, noting these micro-expressions, understood that anxiety and guilt often mirrored one another, making it challenging for an outsider to distinguish between them. At length, the doctor returned to offer his preliminary assessment. He spoke quietly to Mr. Clement before addressing the small group. "There is no visible sign of trauma," he said, "yet the suddenness of death suggests some form of acute intervention, chemical or otherwise, cannot yet be ruled out. More thorough examination is necessary." His statement, precise and measured, caused several villagers to shift uncomfortably. The notion of foul play, once whispered in conjecture, now had an authoritative weight behind it. Miss Marple, listening attentively, felt a familiar thrill of observation. The doctor's words provided context, yet it was the human reactions, the fleeting flicker of worry, the subtle stiffening of posture, the avoidance of certain glances that would ultimately reveal the truth. Linton's small tremor, Timothy's restless energy, Miss Ashcombe's darting eyes, Mrs. Price's pointed insinuations, all were threads to be followed with patience. As afternoon deepened into early evening, the constable began to note the emerging patterns in his own records. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, already had her own mental map of interactions, timing, and behavior. She made no move to intervene, for the village would reveal its secrets in its own time. It was only necessary to watch, to listen, and to remember. Somewhere, within the polished smiles and carefully chosen words, the first faint outlines of the truth were already visible, and Miss Marple, as ever, would discern them long before anyone else. As the evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, the villagers remained within Gable House, their chatter subdued and edged with unease. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, had resumed her knitting, though her eyes continually swept the room. She did not need to speak to gather information. Human nature, she had long observed, revealed itself in gestures, glances, and the small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in speech. It was Mrs. Price who, without intending to, first drew Miss Marple's attention to a detail that would prove significant. The housekeeper had been arranging silverware for a second round of tea when her hand paused, hovering above a small drawer in the sideboard. She glanced around as if ensuring no one noticed, and then replaced the drawer's contents slightly askew. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. Such minor actions, often dismissed as forgetfulness or habit, were rarely accidental. She filed the observation quietly, making no comment but noting the potential connection to the day's events. Timothy, still pale and restless from the morning's questioning, moved to the window, drawing the curtains slightly closed as if to shield himself from prying eyes. Miss Ashcombe hovered nearby, her fingers brushing against his arm in an attempt to calm him. Both were unaware of how revealing their mannerisms were. The slight trembling of hands, the hesitation in speech, the avoidance of certain glances. Miss Marple, however, noted each in turn, storing them in the mental ledger she had long maintained. In St. Mary Mead, appearances were carefully managed, but human instincts often betrayed truth in ways words could not. Meanwhile, Mr. Linton had retreated to a corner of the room, ostensibly to review notes of the previous day, though Miss Marple observed that his gaze kept flicking toward the doorway and the sundial beyond the window. There was an urgency in his movements, a subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested an awareness of observation. He tried to maintain composure, yet every slight twitch of a hand or shift of weight betrayed him just enough for a patient observer to notice. The vicar, sensing the growing tension, attempted to redirect conversation toward practical matters. "We should focus on the facts," he suggested gently. "The location, the timing, and the witnesses. Speculation only serves to heighten anxiety." Yet even his words carried an unspoken warning that something in the day's events did not fit the expected patterns of accident or illness. Miss Marple noted his careful phrasing, understanding that discretion often revealed as much as direct inquiry. Miss Marple excused herself briefly and walked to the garden. The twilight had deepened, casting long shadows that fell across the sundial and flower beds. She knelt beside the gravel where the man had fallen and examined the faint disturbances more closely. A small fragment of fabric, pale and nearly invisible, caught her eye. It was wedged subtly between the gravel and a rose bush, disturbed only by the briefest movement of soil nearby. Most people would have missed it entirely, yet to Miss Marple it was a significant clue, a trace of movement, a hint of contact, perhaps even an overlooked confrontation. Returning indoors, she studied the reactions of the villagers as they passed through the room. Each movement, each glance, seemed to confirm the subtle hypothesis forming in her mind. The death had not been a simple accident, nor was it likely entirely spontaneous. Someone had acted, and the evidence of their action had been nearly invisible to those less observant. The crushed petal, the minor scuff of gravel, the fragment of fabric, all pointed to a fleeting disturbance, carefully disguised. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the collective anxiety, attempted to lighten the mood with small talk. "We must remember," she said, pouring tea for the gathering, "that a day need not be remembered only for misfortune. St. Mary Mead is known for its resilience and calm, is it not?" The words were soothing, yet Miss Marple detected the slight tremor in her voice. Even the most composed villagers were beginning to feel the strain of uncertainty, and their behavior now revealed subtle cracks in their social masks. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Linton and his earlier behavior. The patterns she had observed, the tension, the avoidance of certain glances, the repeated scrutiny of areas near the sundial, suggested a preoccupation with concealment. It was not proof of guilt, but it was sufficient to warrant further attention. Similarly, the reactions of Timothy and Miss Ashcombe indicated anxiety that went beyond mere shock, though whether it was fear of accusation or knowledge of something else remained uncertain. As night fell, the atmosphere within Gable House became more charged. The villagers clustered in small groups, whispering, comparing recollections, and seeking reassurance. Miss Marple, quietly knitting, allowed them to speak freely. Each slip of tongue, each hesitant pause, provided insight. She noted the connections between prior conversations, the subtle inconsistencies in behavior, and the faint traces of physical evidence that had been overlooked. Every detail, no matter how minor, had its place in the larger tapestry she was beginning to perceive. By the time the household retired for the evening, Miss Marple had already pieced together the beginnings of a coherent sequence. The disturbances in the garden, the fragment of fabric, the tense reactions, all suggested that the death was the result of deliberate interference, not accident. Yet she said nothing aloud, for the truth required patience and careful observation. In St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew one another and secrets were hidden beneath layers of courtesy, the smallest gestures often revealed what words concealed. And Miss Marple, as always, had eyes to see and patience to wait. The next morning, a cool mist hung over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village and lending an eerie quiet to the cobblestone lanes. Miss Marple, as was her habit, rose early and walked slowly through the lanes toward Gable House. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and roses, yet beneath the beauty of the morning, a sense of unease lingered. Villagers had begun whispering about the previous day's events, and even those who claimed calm composure could not completely conceal the tremor in their voices or the tension in their hands. Inside Gable House, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. Mr. Clement had returned, this time with a more methodical plan to question those present at the garden party. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, allowed herself to observe without interruption. She noted immediately that yesterday's anxieties had not faded. Indeed, they had sharpened, revealing nuances that might otherwise have remained unnoticed. It was Mrs. Price who first seemed to crack under the scrutiny, though she herself might not have realized it. As she moved about arranging cups and saucers, her eyes frequently darted toward the sundial through the open window, her hand lingering a moment too long on the lace doily beside her. Miss Marple, in the quiet of the corner, noted the small crease in her forehead and the faint flush on her cheeks. Habit or nervousness, perhaps, yet in combination with the timing of her movements, the gestures suggested more than mere habit. Timothy, pacing near the window, appeared distracted yet intensely focused on the activity of others. Miss Ashcombe hovered beside him, her fingers occasionally brushing his arm as though to provide reassurance. Both betrayed a subtle tension, the kind that arises not from guilt alone but from the anxious anticipation of discovery. Miss Marple filed these observations carefully. She had learned long ago that fear and secret knowledge often manifested in the smallest, most revealing ways. The constable began formal questioning, drawing each person in turn. Linton, still seated rigidly in the corner, answered each inquiry with measured politeness, but his eyes continually scanned the room and occasionally flicked toward the garden. When asked to describe his movements near the sundial, he hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before responding, and Miss Marple caught the subtle contraction of his jaw. Such details were nearly invisible to the casual observer, but they painted a quiet portrait of someone at odds with his own words. Mrs. Bantry attempted to interject at intervals, soothing tensions with light conversation, though the effect was fleeting. Her words often drew attention to minor social details, as if to distract from the uncomfortable reality at hand, and she repeatedly glanced at Miss Marple as though hoping for reassurance. The subtle acknowledgment that passed between them, an understanding of the unseen truths beneath ordinary manners, was easily missed by others, yet it confirmed for Miss Marple that certain patterns of behavior were beginning to reveal themselves. A breakthrough in observation came when Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small, partially concealed ledger in the corner of the room, belonging to the deceased. She had not yet examined it closely, but the moment she noticed the faint indentation of recent pencil marks, she understood that someone had either left the book in haste or deliberately tried to obscure its contents. It was a minor detail, yet in a village where everyone knew each other, even the smallest misstep could reveal hidden motives. As the questioning progressed, subtle confrontations began to emerge. Mrs. Price, prompted by a seemingly casual remark from the vicar, revealed a long-standing quarrel between the deceased and Linton over property boundaries and unpaid debts. The revelation sent a ripple through the room. Several villagers shifted uneasily, exchanging glances that suggested knowledge of other past disputes. Miss Marple, quiet and attentive, observed the way Linton's eyes flickered toward the ledger before returning to the floor. The motion was barely perceptible, yet it spoke volumes about his awareness of what might be uncovered. Timothy, prompted inadvertently by Mrs. Bantry, admitted to overhearing a heated argument between Linton and the deceased 2 days prior, a dispute that seemed trivial on the surface, but, Miss Marple noted, had escalated tensions considerably. Miss Ashcombe's reaction was even more telling. A sudden paleness, a tightening of the lips, and a swift glance toward the sundial visible through the window. Each of these tiny, almost instinctual reactions was catalogued meticulously by Miss Marple, who had long relied on the unguarded gestures of others to reveal the truth. The villagers themselves, growing increasingly anxious, began to reveal other secrets. A minor theft at the local shop, a whispered dispute over a will, and subtle insinuations about hidden affairs emerged from the conversations, each one layering motive, a top motive. Yet despite the seemingly chaotic disclosures, Miss Marple discerned order, a web of human behavior, deceit, and anxiety that, once untangled, would illuminate the cause and the responsible party. By late afternoon, the room was heavy with the unspoken awareness of concealed truths. Miss Marple, sitting quietly, did not intervene. Instead, she let the villagers reveal themselves through action, word, and subtle glance. Each disclosure, each hesitation, was a brush-stroke on a larger canvas she was painting in her mind. The interactions of the morning had revealed a pattern. Tensions, rivalries, and minor injustices had converged in a manner that made a simple accident improbable. Someone had acted with intent, and the clues were already whispering their secrets to the patient observer. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple's quiet assessment had formed a coherent beginning. The first hidden threads had been identified, motives began to align, and the faint trail of evidence, physical and behavioral, was becoming discernible. She did not speak of it, for she knew that premature words could unravel subtle truths. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were often hidden beneath the most ordinary actions, and patience, coupled with careful observation, would ultimately uncover the one thread that connected all the others. Miss Marple, as always, was prepared to follow it wherever it might lead. By mid-morning the following day, a crisp wind swept across St. Mary Mead, rustling the leaves of the oak and whispering through the garden at Gable House. Miss Marple, as was her custom, had taken an early walk, noting the way the dew clung to the petals of the roses and the faint tracks of a solitary bird along the gravel path. The village, still uneasy from the previous day's revelations, had taken on a more subdued character, its usual cheer muted by the shadow of suspicion and fear. The events of the morning began with an unexpected interruption. A frantic cry drew the villagers from their homes toward the small lane behind the vicarage, where a second discovery had been made. A neighbor, Mr. Higgins, had noticed the body of a local gardener lying in an abandoned tool shed, faint traces of struggle evident in the disturbed soil beneath him. Though alive, he was unconscious, and the initial examination suggested he had been deliberately attacked, though the motive remained unclear. The discovery immediately shifted attention and anxiety, and the village's polite veneer began to fray. Miss Marple arrived shortly thereafter, her steps quiet but deliberate. She observed the scene from the edge of the crowd, noting the reactions of those present. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe were among the first to arrive, their earlier anxiety now heightened by genuine concern. Timothy's hand trembled slightly as he held Miss Ashcombe's arm, and both cast furtive glances at Mr. Linton, who had appeared almost immediately after the news spread. Linton, for his part, moved with deliberate care, his expression masking the tension that flickered in the briefest of movements. Mr. Clement, accompanied by the doctor, began to take statements, questioning both the unconscious gardener's neighbors and those who had observed the scene from a distance. Miss Marple, positioned just beyond earshot, noted the subtle differences between what people reported and what their behavior suggested. Small gestures, glances toward the garden, slight shifting of weight, the nervous brushing of hair, provided insights far beyond the words spoken. People, she reflected, seldom acted naturally when confronted with uncertainty, and in such moments, truth often emerged in the quietest of ways. The injured gardener had been known to work closely with Linton on the estate, yet Miss Marple quickly noted the gardener's behavior prior to his attack. He had been carrying a bundle of papers, clutched tightly to his chest as he hurried toward the tool shed. The movement had seemed innocuous at the time, yet the fact that the bundle had been disturbed and was now missing suggested it contained something of significance. Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate the contents once the authorities allowed it. Human behavior often left traces, but tangible evidence provided its own kind of testimony. Meanwhile, in the village, speculation was rampant. Mrs. Bantry moved among the gathering crowd, attempting to calm those whose curiosity had grown into fear. "There is no need for panic," she said, though her voice carried a quiver she could not entirely suppress. "Surely someone must have merely stumbled or been careless. The gardener is alive after all." Her words were meant to reassure, yet they inadvertently emphasized the strangeness of the situation. Miss Marple observed the subtle gestures that accompanied her speech. The way Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted the folds of her apron, the slight hitch in her breath, and the quick glance toward the hedge maze. Each movement was a small revelation, hinting at unspoken knowledge or concern. The vicar attempted to restore order, guiding the villagers into a careful discussion of events. He noted that the timing of the gardener's assault suggested a deliberate sequence, and he encouraged everyone to recount their observations. Miss Marple listened patiently, noting the interconnections between past and present events. The sudden violence, juxtaposed against the earlier death at the sundial, suggested a pattern that could not be coincidental. Yet the true nature of the pattern was still concealed behind layers of human behavior. Linton's behavior, increasingly conspicuous, drew subtle attention from several villagers, though none dared speak openly of their suspicions. He moved deliberately close to the garden window, seemingly studying the sundial, and yet his expression suggested inward calculation rather than casual observation. Miss Marple, observing the smallest details, the flick of an eye, the stiffening of a shoulder, the brief shift in posture, recognized a tension born of more than mere curiosity. He was aware of scrutiny and yet determined to conceal his internal state, a challenge she quietly relished. Timothy, pale and anxious, whispered something to Miss Ashcombe, whose reaction was almost immediate, a subtle recoil and a tightening of her lips. Miss Marple filed these details silently. The timing of their interaction, in conjunction with Linton's behavior and the circumstances of the gardener's attack, began to suggest a network of relationships and potential motives previously hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life. As the doctor tended to the unconscious gardener and Mr. Clement oversaw the scene, the villagers began to disperse, returning to their homes under a cloud of apprehension. Miss Marple remained behind, kneeling briefly by the tool shed to inspect the disturbed soil, noting faint footprints and the subtle impression of a gloved hand. These small, almost imperceptible traces would later prove invaluable, yet at that moment they were simply observations to be quietly catalogued. She rose and looked toward the village, sensing the interplay of human nature unfolding in every direction. Secrets, rivalries, and hidden resentments were converging with a precision only a patient observer could perceive. By late afternoon, the mood of St. Mary Mead was palpably altered. The combination of the earlier death, the attempted assault, and the subtle clues Miss Marple had already noted created a web of suspicion and intrigue. She understood, with the quiet certainty that came from years of observing human behavior, that the threads of this mystery were beginning to form a discernible pattern. It was a delicate tapestry, easily disrupted by careless words or actions. Yet each thread, properly examined, would ultimately lead her closer to the truth. And so Miss Marple waited, quietly knitting, her sharp eyes observing each nuance of expression and gesture. The village, unaware of the precise depths of her scrutiny, continued to reveal itself in the subtlest ways. A second act of violence had only intensified the puzzle, and Miss Marple, patient and meticulous, knew that the clues were beginning to speak more clearly. The story was far from finished, and the web of deception was only just beginning to unravel in her perceptive mind. The following morning dawned clear and crisp over St. Mary Mead, the sun casting a gentle glow across the village lanes, Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, tension lingered like a persistent shadow. Miss Marple, rising early as usual, made her customary walk through the village, pausing now and then to observe details others would pass by unnoticed. A gate left slightly ajar, a smear of mud on a doorstep, the faint sound of voices muted behind closed curtains. Each fragment of observation, she knew, could contribute to the unfolding understanding of the previous day's disturbing events. Returning to Gable House, she found the villagers gathered again, their expressions wary, their conversations subdued. Mr. Clement was present, more deliberate in his approach this morning, coordinating statements and organizing notes. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fireplace with her knitting basket, observed as the first interactions of the day unfolded. She did not speak, yet every glance, every gesture, provided information far beyond the spoken word. Linton, predictably, arrived early. He appeared composed on the surface, yet Miss Marple's keen eye detected subtle tells, a slight stiffness in the shoulders, a barely perceptible tremor of the left hand, and the quick, almost imperceptible scan of the room before settling near the window. Each of these tiny movements suggested awareness and careful calculation. He was cautious, perhaps overly so, and Miss Marple filed the observation with quiet precision, noting how he interacted, or avoided interaction, with other villagers. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe were seated near each other, their faces pale, their bodies tense. Miss Marple noticed that Timothy's fingers fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, while Miss Ashcombe's eyes flicked repeatedly toward the doorway and the sundial visible beyond. Their anxiety was tangible, yet it was not the fear of immediate accusation alone. There was something deeper, a hesitancy that suggested knowledge or involvement in events yet unexplored. Miss Marple decided it was time to test the subtle dynamics that she had been quietly observing. She began by addressing small questions to the group, casual and unobtrusive, designed to provoke reactions rather than elicit facts. "I wonder," she said softly, "if anyone noticed anything unusual about the sundial yesterday morning. Perhaps something that seemed trivial at the time, yet might now appear differently in hindsight." Her voice, gentle and unassuming, carried no accusation, yet it caused an immediate ripple among the villagers. Linton's eyes, for an instant, flickered to the window toward the sundial before he forced himself to look at Miss Marple. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Nothing that I can recall," he said carefully, though the slight hesitation in his tone did not escape Miss Marple. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe, on the other hand, exchanged a barely perceptible glance. Their fingers tightened around the edges of the table, a nervous synchronization that Miss Marple quietly noted. Mrs. Price, ever eager to assert knowledge, spoke up immediately. "The sundial, you say. I suppose one might notice if it had been disturbed, but surely no one would think to examine such trivialities unless something seemed amiss." She swept a hand lightly across the mantel, as if brushing away lingering doubts. Yet Miss Marple observed the subtle tension in her posture, the way her shoulders rose slightly with each breath, betraying a nervousness carefully masked by authority. The vicar, sensing an opportunity to restore order, intervened. "It is wise to consider all possibilities," he suggested. "Small details often illuminate larger truths, yet we must not jump to conclusions based solely on observation. Facts must guide us." His words, tempered and cautious, carried an underlying acknowledgement. He too sensed the irregularities, the hidden motives that the village had been reluctant to confront. Miss Marple continued her subtle psychological test, turning her attention to casual remarks about the tool shed incident. "It is fortunate that the gardener is recovering," she said gently. "And yet the timing of events makes one wonder whether accidents are as simple as they seem. I am sure everyone recalls where they were when it occurred." The statement, innocent on the surface, prompted a flurry of minor reactions. Linton shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze briefly flitting toward the garden window. Timothy swallowed hard, while Miss Ashcombe's fingers tightened around the hem of her dress. Mrs. Price's lips pressed into a thin line as she exchanged a quick glance with Mr. Clement. Miss Marple allowed these subtle cues to accumulate. In her mind, she mapped them carefully. Linton's guarded movements, Timothy and Miss Ashcombe's synchronous tension, Mrs. Price's micro-expressions, all suggested layers of hidden knowledge and anxiety. She did not need overt confession. Human nature had already begun to reveal the threads of truth. Later, she walked quietly through the garden, revisiting the sundial, the gravel, and the flower beds. Small disturbances, the faint imprint of a gloved hand, a petal crushed in an unusual place, and the fragment of pale fabric she had noticed earlier, spoke volumes when interpreted in conjunction with the villagers' behavior. The psychological observations of the morning aligned with these physical traces, forming a more coherent pattern than any one clue could provide. Miss Marple returned indoors just as the sun reached its zenith, her calm demeanor unchanged, yet her mind actively connecting threads. Each interaction, each hesitation, each glance held significance. In St. Mary Mead, where appearances were carefully maintained and secrets carefully hidden, the truth often required patience, subtle testing, and the quiet observation of human instinct. And Miss Marple, as always, had both the skill and the patience to allow the pattern to reveal itself in its own time. By midday, she had already begun to form the outline of a theory. Human behavior, rather than brute evidence, was the key. The subtle reactions she had elicited, combined with the earlier physical clues, suggested a deliberate orchestration behind the sundial death and the gardener's assault. The final threads were beginning to emerge, and she knew that the next careful interactions, if handled properly, would reveal more than anyone suspected. By late afternoon, the soft light of St. Mary Mead slanted across the village streets, glinting off the tidy gardens and casting long, slender shadows. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner of Gable House, knitting quietly, though her mind was far from idle. Over the past 2 days, she had observed every gesture, every glance, every slip of speech with meticulous care. Now, patterns were emerging, subtle, intricate, and delicate, but unmistakable to an eye attuned to human nature. The first thread she considered was Linton. His behavior since the initial incident had been carefully measured, almost unnaturally so, yet he could not completely mask the tension that betrayed his thoughts. Miss Marple recalled the fleeting glance he had given the sundial through the window, the small twitch in his left hand, and the way his posture stiffened whenever certain names were mentioned. Each was a minor clue in isolation, but together they suggested an internal conflict that hinted at deeper involvement. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe, meanwhile, continued to exhibit signs of anxious collaboration. Their movements were synchronized almost imperceptibly, their eyes flicking toward each other and toward Linton at key moments. Miss Marple observed that their worry was not merely fear of accusation, but a subtle recognition of secrets shared among them. The faint tightening of Timothy's jaw when a subject was broached, the delicate curl of Miss Ashcombe's fingers around her scarf, and their almost imperceptible breathing pattern revealed more than words ever could. The fragment of pale fabric Miss Marple had noticed in the garden, the scuff in the gravel near the sundial, and the crushed rose petal now formed a pattern in her mind. Each piece of physical evidence had been small, almost negligible to the casual observer, yet when combined with the villagers' behavior, they hinted at deliberate interference. The question, she realized, was not whether the death had been intentional. It almost certainly was, but rather who had orchestrated it and to what end. Mrs. Price, seated near the hearth, continued her quiet vigilance, subtly directing conversation and guiding glances without overtly asserting control. Miss Marple noted the micro-expressions that accompanied her words. A slight narrowing of the eyes when Linton's name was mentioned, a faint flush that crept across her cheeks when Timothy spoke, and a barely perceptible hesitation in her gestures. Even the housekeeper's meticulous arrangement of cups and saucers had become a form of psychological signaling, each adjustment deliberate and potentially meaningful. Miss Marple decided it was time to allow the villagers to reveal more through their interactions. She began asking seemingly innocent questions that touched on recent grievances and disputes. "I wonder," she said softly, "if anyone recalls any disagreements or small resentments that might have been present yesterday. Perhaps things that seemed unimportant at the time but now might take on new significance." Her tone was casual, almost conversational, yet it was designed to provoke reactions that could reveal hidden truths. Linton's response was careful, almost too careful. "None, I believe," he said, though the microsecond hesitation before he spoke betrayed an awareness of potential implications. Timothy, however, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes momentarily meeting Miss Ashcombe's before darting elsewhere. Miss Ashcombe's lips pressed into a thin line, and she raised her hand slightly as if to distract from her nervous reaction. Miss Marple observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. The tension confirmed the presence of deeper, intertwined motives. Mrs. Price, attempting to reassert her composure, interjected with what she intended to be a clarifying remark. "Well, we all know that minor disputes happen," she said primly, "but surely no one would act upon them so drastically. A momentary disagreement is hardly cause for extreme measures." Her words were precise, but Miss Marple detected the almost imperceptible twitch of her left hand, the faint flare of nostrils, subtle signs of suppressed emotion or perhaps an awareness she did not wish to admit. The vicar, sensing the rising tension, encouraged the villagers to consider context. "It is often the smallest, seemingly trivial things that lead to greater consequences," he said gently. "Yet it is also human nature to hide these truths until the right moment reveals them." His words, measured and unobtrusive, seemed intended more to observe the reactions of others than to offer advice. Miss Marple noted the fleeting glances exchanged among the villagers, the careful avoidance of eye contact, and the small adjustments in posture that suggested unease and recognition of shared secrets. Miss Marple then turned her attention back to the garden, recalling the subtle signs of disturbance, the fabric fragment, the scuffed gravel, and the crushed rose. Each clue aligned with her observations of behavior indoors. Linton's furtive glances, Timothy's nervous synchrony with Miss Ashcombe, and Mrs. Price's calculated actions all suggested a chain of events deliberately concealed. The pieces fit together in her mind like a carefully constructed puzzle. The outline of motive, opportunity, and deliberate misdirection was becoming increasingly coherent. By late afternoon, she realized that she had enough understanding of the human interactions to begin a form of psychological testing. The villagers, unaware of the subtle web being observed, continued their cautious conversation, each revealing more of themselves than they intended. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, allowed the dialogue to unfold naturally, making mental notes of contradictions, hesitations, and signs of concealed tension. Each observation reinforced her growing certainty. The death at the sundial and the gardener's assault were connected, orchestrated by someone carefully manipulating both events and the perceptions of those around them. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, Miss Marple's quiet reflection confirmed a singular truth. The threads of deception were now clearly discernible, and the next step would be to watch for the subtle reactions that would reveal the final connections. She did not speak of it, for timing was essential. In St. Mary Mead, patience and observation had always been the surest path to uncovering the secrets people worked so hard to conceal. The following morning dawned with a pale, silvery light over St. Mary Mead, casting a quiet serenity that belied the tensions lingering from the previous days. Miss Marple, as usual, rose early and walked through the dew-laden lanes, reflecting on the observations she had accumulated. Every gesture, every glance, every small disturbance in the garden, all of it pointed to a chain of deliberate events, and she now felt confident she could discern the threads connecting motive, opportunity, and action. Today, she decided, the truth would emerge. Miss Marple arrived at Gable House shortly after breakfast, where the villagers were gathered under a tense, expectant atmosphere. Mr. Clement, sensing the opportunity for clarity, had requested that everyone remain in the drawing-room. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, allowed the first murmurs of speculation to fade, quietly observing reactions. She noted how Linton's fingers drummed lightly against his knee, Timothy's shoulders hunched with nervous anticipation, and Miss Ashcombe's eyes flicked toward the window, tracing the sundial with subtle, almost compulsive attention. Mrs. Price, composed as ever, appeared calm, yet the faint paling of her cheeks revealed restrained anxiety. "Before we proceed," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but deliberate, "I should like to recount some small observations that may illuminate what occurred." She allowed the silence to settle, letting every eye turn toward her. Sometimes it is not the dramatic or obvious acts that reveal the truth, but the quiet details, those nearly invisible gestures that pass unnoticed by all but a careful observer. She paused, glancing briefly at Linton, then at Timothy and Miss Ashcombe. Each flicker of attention was absorbed with quiet precision. She first addressed the physical clues in the garden. The sundial, of course, was the site of the first unfortunate event. Close observation revealed a minor disturbance in the gravel, a crushed rose petal, and a fragment of pale fabric. These small things might seem insignificant, yet they indicate deliberate movement near the sundial and interference with the gentleman who fell. She allowed the weight of her words to settle over the group, noting how Timothy shifted slightly and how Linton's eyes darted briefly toward the window, as if confirming her remarks against memory. "Now," she continued, "the gardener's assault yesterday, occurring in the tool shed, appears at first unrelated. Yet the bundle he carried and the position in which he was found tell us that someone sought to retrieve or conceal an item of importance. The timing of both incidents is too precise to be coincidental." Her words drew a murmur from Mrs. Bantry and a slight stiffening of Linton's posture. Miss Marple watched silently, allowing the reactions to reveal the deeper truths. She then moved to the subtle behaviors she had observed over the past days. Some gestures cannot be falsified. A fleeting glance, the smallest twitch of a hand, the unconscious coordination between two people who share a secret. "Linton, you have attempted to maintain composure, yet your attention continually returned to the sundial and the garden. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe, your tension and synchrony indicate shared knowledge of events beyond what has been openly acknowledged. Mrs. Price, your careful control of discussion and subtle manipulation of interactions suggests awareness of more than casual housekeeping duties." She paused again, letting the weight of her deductions sink in. "The connection is clear," she said finally, her knitting resting in her lap. All three were involved, each in a different way, yet acting toward a single objective. The deceased gentleman had uncovered something they wished to conceal, an item of financial significance that would have disrupted plans long in motion. The fabric, the scuff in the gravel, the disturbed bundle, all point to deliberate interference to prevent exposure. The gardener, unwittingly involved, was attacked to protect the secrecy of their plan, though fortunately he survived. Each action was carefully measured to manipulate appearances, delay suspicion, and obscure culpability. A hush fell over the room. Timothy swallowed audibly, Miss Ashcombe's hands tightened around her scarf, and Linton's fingers twitched nervously. Mrs. Price's eyes widened, just enough to betray a flicker of acknowledgement. Miss Marple, watching each reaction, nodded ever so slightly. Human nature, as always, reveals itself in the smallest details. she said gently. Words can be chosen, stories rehearsed, but instinct, fear, and knowledge leave traces that are impossible to fully erase. At this, Linton's composure broke entirely. "It wasn't supposed to," he began, voice faltering, and Timothy shifted uncomfortably while Miss Ashcombe's lips pressed tight. Miss Marple's eyes were calm, almost kindly. "Yes, you are all aware," she said. "And now, with patience and attention, the truth can be acknowledged openly. Your plan, the steps you took, and the consequences have all been observed, even if subtly. No detail is too small for consideration, and all human action leaves its mark." Mrs. Price exhaled sharply, her hands falling to her lap, while the vicar watched in quiet amazement. Timothy and Miss Ashcombe, now fully aware that concealment was no longer possible, exchanged a guilty glance. Linton, shoulders slumping, admitted in a low voice, "It was meant only to delay, never to cause harm." Miss Marple nodded gently, allowing the confession to surface without accusation. The constable, now emboldened by the clarity provided, took the three into further questioning to record the full account. Outside, the village remained calm in appearance, yet an unmistakable shift had taken place. Secrets had been revealed, justice quietly asserted, and the threads of deception laid bare. Miss Marple, settling back in her chair, reflected upon the interplay of human behavior, observation, and the inevitability of truth. As evening descended over St. Mary Mead, peace returned, though with a subtle undercurrent of awareness that the village's tranquility had been shaken and its inhabitants' hidden motives exposed. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, sipped her tea and smiled faintly. Once again, patience, attention to human nature, and the smallest observations had unraveled a mystery that others might have dismissed as inexplicable. In St. Mary Mead, life would continue, but the subtle knowledge of truth would linger beneath the polite civility that defined the village.